Greetings, class. My name's Randy Wells. I'll be your instructor for Modern European History. For those of you that don't know me, I've been teaching at West Coast since 2014, and I teach about 6 to 7 different history classes in the education department. My family and I have been members of Lancaster Baptist Church for 25 years now. I am a military veteran. I served in the Air Force for 25 years, retired as a master sergeant. I went on to pursue my undergraduate degree in military history through American Military University. Then I got my master's degree in history through Liberty University, and currently I'm in a PhD program with Liberty University as well. Now, hopefully you have obtained the required textbook for this course by John Merriman, and you're going to definitely need that going into this first week. And so we're going to cover the French Revolution in this module, and I would encourage you to get your syllabus out, take a look at it, review the requirements, the course requirements, what's expected of you to do to succeed in this class. And also, I have prepared slides for you that you can view along as you watch this lecture. So I'll refer to slide 1, slide 2, or I might say something like next slide, and that's your cue to kind of advance whatever medium you're using to view the slides so that we can kind of stay together in tandem since we're not face-to-face in class. All right, why is it important to know history? And there's a video that I'd like you to watch at this time, very short video that talks about Holocaust denial, something that's a real phenomenon going on in our country and really around the world. And the further and further that we are removed from the events that happened during the Holocaust, this is just one example, the easier it is for folks, especially in your generation, to kind of wonder, did that really even happen? Can I believe the history books, etc.? So why is it important to know history? Well, it's very important. So next slide. In the realm of academia, historians would agree that ancient history, or the classical period, began around 3000 BC and ended in around 476 AD when the Goths sacked Rome. From about 500 to 1500 AD, there was a period in world history known as the medieval period, or also called the Dark Ages, or sometimes the Middle Ages. But Bible believers call that 1,000-year period the Dark Ages. And the reason we call it that is because the Word of God was being suppressed by the Roman Catholic Church in Europe, and so it was a very spiritually dark time. Now, from about 1500 AD until now, 400 plus years of history is termed the modern era and is subdivided into the years 15 to 1800. We would call that the early modern period. This is the European exploration age, the age of revolutions, etc. From 1801 to about 1945, we would call that the late modern period. Industrialization is seen in, of course, the Second World War. First and Second World War, and the Civil War in America. 1946 to our present day in 2021, 2022, the postmodern period, where we see much cultural change and a unfortunate rejection of absolute truth. Next slide. The history of Europe can't be understood without attention to Europe's interaction with cultures in the rest of the world. The Bible says in Genesis 10 verse 2, it talks about the 7 founding families of the Japhetic nations. And it says the sons of Japheth, Gomer, and Magog, and Madai, and Javan, and Tubal, and Meshach, and Tiras. And through doing studies of what those words and terms mean, we come to understand that Gomer would correspond to the Anglo-Saxons, the Celts, the Picts, the settlers of ancient Scotland and Ireland, the Gauls of medieval Europe. Magog would be your Turks. Madai corresponds to your Kurds, Javan to the Greeks and Romans. Tubal and Meshach found their home, their origin in northern Armenia, and today would be identified with the Russians. And Tirans would be the Thracians. To be sure, Europeans have learned from Muslim, African, and American cultures. However, through commercial contact and conquest and intellectual, religious, and political influence, the European powers and cultures have affected the histories of non-Western peoples more than the reverse. Unless you're Native American, African, Middle Eastern, or Asian, your ancestors were likely European like mine, and you descended from Noah's son Japheth. The growth of strong, centralized states helped shape modern Europe as we know it today. Medieval Europe was a maze of overlapping political and judicial authorities, and Europeans defined themselves in terms of family, village, town, or religious affiliation. Now, by way of comparison, Europeans behaved, thought, and influenced those around them differently during the Renaissance than during, say, the Age of Enlightenment. Now, during this course, we're going to explore how the end of absolutism, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute, led naturally to the rise of Enlightenment and liberalism. We'll survey the initiation of the Great War, the causation for that. We'll talk about imperialism. We'll talk about the spread of nationalism and unification in Europe, and then we'll get into of course, two great wars, the Great War and then World War II. We'll talk about the Cold War and the collapse of communism in Europe and Russia. Next slide. We're going to begin this course with the turn of the 18th century, but spend the majority in what is called the long 19th century, which was a period beginning in 1789 with the French Revolution and was marked by two revolutions that produced extended periods of military conflict and radical reform. The long 19th century ends in 1914 with the start of the cataclysmic Great War, or World War I. Now, while this may not be a class in military history, it's vital that you understand and appreciate the following statement. Warfare is the engine that turns the wheel of history. Let me say that again. Warfare is the engine that turns the wheel of history. And trying to study human history without studying warfare is akin to studying theology without studying God. You just can't do it. The two are linked. And I say this because during this course, we'll briefly survey some major conflicts, some wars, which you'll need to become familiar with. Next slide. The 18th century, so from the years 1700 to 1800, could best be characterized as the age of reason or the age of enlightenment. The age of enlightenment. Europeans began to think kind of outside the box during this time when it came to traditionally held ideals. And some of those traditionally held ideals that were now challenged were things like religion, politics, authority, the divine right of kings, is the earth flat, and others. And some of these thinkers considered themselves enlightened, hence the term enlightenment. And these thinkers were called philosophes, which is French for philosophers. Next slide. Philosophes started to question Christian beliefs, preferring rational understanding to faith. They said that humans were perfectly able to discover truth for themselves instead of just believing the scriptures. And although some and most still believed in God during the Age of Enlightenment, eventually these philosophes started to question the basis of everything, religion, morality, and government, and etc. And some believed in natural religion based on reason. Enlightenment thinkers also criticized accepted ideas about government. They wondered if the long-held belief of what was called the divine right of kings to rule was the correct view. And one can see how this type of thinking challenged the long-held, centuries-old feudal systems of Europe. Next slide. Now, the feudal or seigneurial system was a system that had dominated much of Europe for centuries, and it was sustained by the rights and privileges given to the upper class or to the rich. Everything was a source of privilege for the nobles, the nobility. They had 1,000 pretexts for establishing taxes on their vassals, who were generally considered taxable and to be worked at will. Kings and councils waived the necessity of their studying in order to be received as bachelors of universities. If somebody of the nobility was made a prisoner of war, for example, his life would be saved because he was noble. A ransom would be paid, etc. So if you were a nobleman or a noblewoman during the feudal system, you had it made. But if you were, like everybody else, a vassal, then life was indeed very difficult. Next slide. The 18th century, again, the Age of Enlightenment, started to break away from the strict age of absolutism. We would characterize the 16th and 17th centuries of, we could say that that was the age of absolutism because of the reign of absolute monarchs. And as you will see on the next slide, there's some examples of some of the most famous absolute monarchs in European history. A monarchy is the rule by a king or queen which is predicated on their bloodline. An absolute monarch is a sovereign who possesses absolute power over all aspects of government. So next slide, here's some examples of some of the most notable ones. We have Ivan the Terrible of Russia, Louis XIV of France, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, Philip II, Frederick I, and so on. And so these are all absolute monarchs. Next slide. Now, if you look at a map of Europe during this period, you will discover that regions were kind of carved up or divided up according to both monarchical and religious rule. Next slide. Now, you can't study European history without coming across this term, Holy Roman Empire. Holy Roman Empire, or the HRE. The Holy Roman Empire saw its tenure from about 800 AD with the crowning of Charlemagne, Charles I, and it ended in about 1806. The Holy Roman Empire is also called the First Reich. Now, we've all heard of the Third Reich, at least I hope you have. That's Hitler's Third Reich in World War II. But there was a First Reich, that's the Holy Roman Empire. There was a Second Reich, that's Kaiser Wilhelm II's empire in Germany. And this Holy Roman Empire had a wide reach of power and control until the 1600s, when it was challenged by Protestants in what became known as the 30 Years' War. 30 Years' War began in 1618. And it lasted until 1648, when it was ended with the Treaty of Westphalia. And after that war, the Holy Roman Empire's influence was significantly diminished, and so that war is something to remember. It's very important. Next slide. So from about 800 to 1648, the Holy Roman Empire pretty much controlled most of Europe, and its base of operations was what is now Germany. In France, however, a monarch had been ruler since 481 AD, and his name was Clovis I. And he was part and founder of the Merovingian dynasty, and really the founder of the French state. History would ultimately Latinize his name to Louis, a name that would live on in French royalty for centuries. In fact, through 18 different kings, all had that name Louis. And it still remains a popular name today in French culture. In 1870, France saw its last king as monarch and adopted a republican form of government, similar to other Western nations. Next slide. King Louis XIV came to the French throne during the 30 Years' War and seriously challenged the dominion of the Holy Roman Empire. Next slide. I'm sorry, don't go to the next slide yet. King Louis, let me speak a little bit more about King Louis XIV. King Louis XIV reigned from 1643 until 1715, and he of any other king during that age, he really epitomized the age of absolutism. Louis XIV was known as the Sun King, because everything revolved around him. He was the longest reigning monarch, and still is, in European history. He reigned for 72 years. Now, Queen Elizabeth II is right on his heels. She has been reigning as Queen of England now for 70 years. Queen Victoria reigned for 62 years. Next slide. The War of the Spanish Succession kicked off in 1701 in Europe, and the result of that war was the end of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. Now, the Habsburg dynasty, probably an unfamiliar term to most of you, was an Austrian-based ruling house or clan or family that, much like the House of Tudor in England, which was from Henry VIII, this Habsburg dynasty essentially ruled over most of Europe for 500 years. Now, at this point, I want to kind of briefly stop and go over the four major dynastic houses in Europe that sort of strove with each other for control and hegemony over Europe during the 19th and early part of the 20th century. And alliances between these various dynasties were typically arranged through marriages. like Louis XV and Marie Antoinette. She was Austrian, she was a Habsburg. He was French, so he was a Bourbon. And when the Great War started, the German, the English, and the Russian heads of state were all related due to intermarriage between dynastic houses. So, in no particular order of importance, next slide, we have first the Habsburgs, as I've mentioned, the Habsburgs. These were considered the most successful family in European history. The Habsburgs were Austrians, and at their apex in the 1500s, they dominated Europe as no other family has done before or since. The Habsburgs were known for making advantageous marriages. They weren't necessarily known for being warriors or explorers. They expanded their holdings less by the sword than by the wedding ring. The marriage of Isabella of Spain to Charles V linked Austria with Spain and began what's known as the Spanish Habsburgs, which ended with the death of Charles II in 1700. In 1866, Prussia defeated Austria and forced it to abandon its claims of leadership over Germany. And so moving into power in Germany was the Prussian house, which next slide, is called the Hohenzollerns. The Hohenzollerns. So, the Hohenzollern dynasty. The Hohenzollerns arose from obscurity during the Middle Ages. More warlike than the Habsburgs, they expanded their holdings through conquest and ingenuity versus marriage. It's been said that they had a remarkable history not just of ruling countries, but of inventing the countries they wanted to rule. The first Hohenzollern of note was Count Friedrich Wilhelm, who was appointed the Prince of Brandenburg, modern Berlin. His descendants increased their territorial holdings during the next 150 years by expanding to the east and acquiring Prussia. During the mid to late 1600s, the Hohenzollern trademark would be that of a superbly trained military. And of course, the most famous Prussian is King Frederick the Great. Next slide. Thirdly, we have the Romanovs, the Romanov dynasty. By 1914, the Romanov family had completed its 300th year on the Russian throne. The first Romanov, Tsar, or Caesar, or leader, was Michael, crowned in 1613. The Romanovs didn't really burst out on the European scene until about 100 years later, when Peter I, also known as Peter the Great, became Tsar of Russia in 1682. Peter was so determined to force Russia into the modern Western world that by his death in 1725, he had completely transformed Russian society into a major power player among the nations of the world. Peter married a Lutheran woman named Marta, who was rechristened in the Russian Orthodox faith and renamed Empress Catherine I at Peter's death in 1712. After ruling Russia until her death, Catherine's daughter by Peter the Great bore a son named Peter III, who married a German princess named Catherine. After having Peter III murdered, Catherine took the Russian throne for herself and became Catherine the Great. Next slide. Finally, we have the Bourbon dynasty. The Bourbon dynasty. The royal Bourbons originated in 1268 when the heiress of the lordship of Bourbon married a younger son of King Louis IX. Henry IV became the first Bourbon king of France in 1589. And Bourbon monarchs then unified France with the small kingdom of Navarre, which Henry's father had acquired by marriage in 1555 and ruled until his 1792 overthrow. Restored briefly in 1814 and definitively in 1815, after the fall of the First French Empire, the senior line of Bourbons was finally overthrown in the July Revolution of 1830. So, there you have it. 4 major dynastic houses in Europe: the Austrian-based Habsburgs, the Prussian Hohenzollerns, the Russian Romanovs, and the French Bourbons. So you're going to kind of need to remember these 4 houses because it's going to come up a lot during this course. Next slide. When Spain's Habsburg king Charles II died in 1700, he had no male successor to the throne. So the question then of whom would succeed him caused some trouble throughout Europe. And an attempt to solve the problem was made by dividing up the empire between France, Austria, and Bavaria. But that did not work. On his deathbed, Charles II bequeathed the entire Spanish inheritance on Philip V, the Duke of Anjou, the second eldest grandson of King Louis XIV of France. With Philip now ruling in Spain, Louis XIV would be able to secure great advantages for the Bourbon dynasty, but his rivals regarded a dominant house of Bourbon as a threat to the entire European main stability. Therefore, they went to war over it. And that war is called the War of the Spanish Succession. England joined with Holland to support Austria against France. There was great loss of life, like any war. And the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 ultimately ended that war, with France gaining the most. Everyone now accepted the right of Philip and the Bourbon dynasty to Spain and the Spanish colonies overseas. Now, it's important to realize how all these events relate to one another and to understand the ripple effect that each one of these has on the history of Europe. In the late 1500s, Queen Elizabeth I shocked England when she championed the Protestant cause. In 1618, I mentioned this war a little bit ago, Protestants went to war against Catholics over religious freedom, and it was called the 30 Years' War. And it was this war that started people thinking that, perhaps maybe Catholicism does not have all the answers. By the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, France was seriously overextended, and things were about to stretch her pocketbook even more when she agreed to underwrite and finance a large portion of the Revolutionary War here in America. So, now that we have a brief introduction behind us, let's proceed with looking at the French Revolution. The French Revolution. Next slide. Let's talk about the background to the French Revolution. French revolutionary ideas drew heavily on the political philosophy of the Enlightenment and the writings of the philosophes. They also borrowed from other political systems. As an example, many French revolutionaries had studied British government and society and came to admire its constitutional basis, its separation of powers, the English Bill of Rights, the tolerance for individual rights and freedoms. And this in turn led to the adoption of a revolutionary slogan, a 3-word slogan, which really epitomizes the ideology of the French Revolution. And this slogan was liberty, equality, fraternity. And so let's look at each one of these individually. Let's go to the next slide. Liberty. In the context of the 18th century, liberty was freedom from oppression, and particularly oppression by the state or government. And the most visible instruments of oppression in the Ancien regime, which is what we would term the old way of doing things, were something known as the lettres de cachet, the lettres de cachet, or sealed orders signed by the king. These lettres, or letters, had several functions, but their most common was to detain and imprison individuals without due process of law, something we would never dream of here in America. Another example of state oppression was the censorship of publications containing criticisms of the king, the church, or the nobility. And now we've kind of seen some of this in recent days with the cancel culture movement. And by the way, folks, whenever this occurs within a government, you can be sure that tyranny is just around the corner. Next slide. So we have liberty. Then we have equality. Equality also underpinned the ideas of the French Revolution. The social structure of the Ancien regime was inherently uneven and unfair, particularly when it came to taxation. The citizens of the Third Estate wanted equality, though some wanted greater levels of equality than others. And the rising middle class in France, or what we would term the bourgeois, a French word, wanted political and social equality with the upper class, the nobility, or the Second Estate. And for this, they looked to the newly formed United States, where our own revolution had transferred government to men of talent and ability, not necessarily based on how much money they had. But the bourgeois was more reluctant about sharing political equality with the lower ranks of the Third Estate in France. They didn't support universal voting rights, believing voting to be a privilege for the property class only. And then the third word, next slide. The third word is fraternity. Fraternity, best described as brotherhood. Fraternity suggested that France, the citizens of France, were bound together in solidarity. It combined nationalism with love and concern for one's fellow citizen. Fraternity was the most abstract, idealistic, and unachievable of all the revolutionary ideals. Next slide. Let's look at causes now. Causes. Next slide. Major causes for the French Revolution, in a nutshell, was money problems, financial. Merriman states in your textbook that, quote, the serious financial crisis that confronted the monarchy in the 1780s was the short-term cause of the French Revolution. Next slide. Financial crisis. France had been at war with Britain and other European powers on and off for more than a century. Not only do wars cost money, the French Minister of Finance had also been arranging loans which funneled about 3/4 of the state of France's expenses to the paying off of debts incurred from 3 recent wars: the War of the Austrian Succession, the War of the Spanish Succession, the 7 Years' War, and the American Revolution. Basically, the French monarchy was living beyond its means, and next slide, by 1789, was in financial collapse. Now, what does a nation do to help bring money back into its treasury? Well, it taxes its citizens. It raises taxes. Next slide. The problem was, unlike nations like England, France went about collecting taxes not very efficiently. France had no central bank, and so the monarchy depended upon private interests. So this creates this huge social rift in French society, and there's an obvious class distinction. It didn't help matters that Louis XV's great-grandfather, King Louis XIV, had supervised the building of this lavish, expensive, magnificent palace that you could visit today, called the Palace of Versailles. The Palace of Versailles really epitomized and symbolized the age of absolutism and the Ancien regime. Next slide. So, while King Louis XV and his Austrian queen, Marie Antoinette, threw lavish parties, ate the best food, and wore the most expensive and outlandish clothes, the average French citizen struggled to find even a loaf of bread. And while he may have looked regal, King Louis XV was not much of a leader. Next slide. Things came to a head, and the new Minister of Finance asked the king to call the Assembly of Notables together. This was a group of hand-picked representatives from the Estates General. So you had the clergy, you had the nobility, and you had everyone else, or 97% of the population. And so this Estates General, again, nobility, clergy, everybody else, for the purpose of tax reform, was called together. The finance minister, wanted the nobility to begin paying land taxes. The assembly rejected his ideas and persuaded the king to fire him and replace him with yet another finance minister. And like his predecessor, the new guy wanted tax reform, and he finally persuaded some members of the Assembly of Notables to agree, the nobles, to pay more taxes. Again, this is like 1% of the population of France, on the condition that their privileged status remained untouched. And so next slide, the king then finds himself kind of in between a rock and a hard place here. He needed to reduce the privileges of the nobility to bail France out of its money problems, but to do so without their approval would be akin to him being labeled a tyrant. On the other hand, giving in to their demands would suggest to to other nations and even to the commoners that he was a puppet of the nobility. On August the 8th, 1788, King Louis XV decreed that he would call the Estates General to meet on May the 1st of the following year. Now, they hadn't met in 175 years. He hoped he could avoid royal bankruptcy if they would agree to the new taxes. So a vote would be taken, but the vote was not fair. Next slide. The problem with the decision was that the representative voting strength from each of the 3 estates was equal, when twice as many votes should have gone to the 3rd estate, because they comprised the majority of the French population, 97%. And this sort of thing is prevented, thankfully, in the United States, at least now, with something called the Electoral College. The number of electors in each state is equal to the number of members of Congress to which the state is entitled. Not so in France at this time. Next slide. Political writers like Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès and members of the Society of 30, like the Marquis de Lafayette, saw the unfairness of this and started giving out pamphlets proposing that the Third Estate, the commoners, be entitled to twice as many voting seats in the Estates General as the other two members, the clergy and the nobility. One of these pamphlets was called, "What is the Third Estate?" What is the Third Estate? And in that pamphlet I've included in Canvas for you as a handout, and you're going to need to read that. And so, what is the Third Estate? Proclaimed that the nobility were no nation at all, but a nation within a nation. Next slide. In December 1788, the king agreed to double the number of representatives of the Third Estate, but then declined to give all those members an individual vote. Next slide. On May the 5th, 1789, the nearly 120 members of the assembled Estates General, about half of whom represented the Third Estate, met at the Palace of Versailles. The king welcomed the first two estates, the clergy and nobility, but purposely excluded, in fact, he locked them out, the Third Estate, made him wait outside for 2 hours. And after finishing his speech, those 600 members of the Third Estate violated protocol by putting their hats back on their heads. This was a right reserved only for the First and Second Estates. Fearing royal reprisal, they withdrew to a nearby indoor tennis court and declared themselves to be the National Assembly. And this is what is known as the famous tennis court oath. This group swore an oath that they would not disband until they had formed a constitution. Next slide. This constitution would limit the authority of the king, and rather than Louis, the King of France, he would now be known as Louis, the King of the French. This was a huge change that suggested that he would now embody the sovereignty of the French people. The National Assembly ratified its own constitution and ignited the revolution. Now I'm going to stop here. We're at about 32 minutes. We'll pick it up at about slide 40 in the next lecture.